He married her for land, horses, cattle, 100 acres of prime Apache soil, all his, in exchange for one silent girl in a white-painted face. She never smiled. She never spoke. But on their wedding night, as wind clawed at the walls and blood soaked through his shirt, she looked him dead in the eyes and said 5 words in Apache, words that made him tremble harder than the bullet in his chest. This wasn't a marriage, it was a sentence, and now the debt's come due. A crack tore through the silence like lightning through bone. The gunshot echoed off the canyon walls, scattering the night birds and driving a hush across the gathered men. The fire between them snapped and flared, spitting sparks into the dark. Before we go further into the truth behind the stolen land, the blood debt, and the 5 words that stopped a man's heart on his wedding night, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. These stories are more than fiction, they echo real histories buried in dust and silence. Your support helps us keep telling them with the care they deserve. One click means more than you know, thank you. Evan Callahan staggered back, his white buckskin shirt blooming red just beneath the collarbone. His hand clutched the wound as if trying to press time itself back inside his body. Across the fire, she didn't move. Nalina stood with the barrel still smoking in her hand, not a tremor, not a blink. Her shadow danced behind her, long and flickering like a spirit called forth from the flame. Her eyes, obsidian and unreadable, met his. Not with hatred, not even with anger, but with something colder, older, as if the ground itself had risen to collect its due. The other men didn't dare speak. The wind moved through the lodge poles outside, dragging loose hide like a drum skin. Somewhere in the distance, a horse shrieked. He fell to his knees, his breath ragged. The pain hadn't fully hit yet. Shock was still a veil over his mind, but her words broke through. 5 of them. Spoken low, in Apache. Gojo ho niha anili diji. He didn't need a translator. He'd learned enough from her father, from long nights trading silence for survival, to grasp their weight. Peace was not your gift. His mouth opened, but no sound came. Nalina stepped forward, the revolver still loose in her grip, as if she didn't plan to fire again. She wasn't here to kill him. Not yet. She was here to deliver a sentence, one etched long ago into the scars of her people, carried now by her alone. The fire snapped again, lighting her face from below. In that glow, Evan saw it not vengeance, not cruelty, but sorrow. Deep, marrow-deep sorrow, wrapped in resolve. And something else. She was afraid. Not of him, not of the blood, but of what came next. His eyes darted toward the dark outside the firelight, as if some truth waited just beyond it. Boots crunching brush, voices in a language older than the flag above his ranch, the gathering storm of justice long denied. She spoke again, softer this time. Not to him, not to anyone in the circle. A prayer, maybe. A goodbye. He slumped to the dirt. And as the fire crackled on, and the drums of the wind grew louder against the walls of hide and pine, Evan Callahan understood this was not the ending of a wedding. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The wind carried dust down the narrow ridge road as Evan Callahan rode into the clearing, his boots worn, his hat pulled low, and his shirt damp from the desert heat. A circle of riders waited, still as stone, feathers braided into their horses' manes and paint streaked across their cheeks like war maps turned funeral scripts. At the center stood Chief Hashke, tall and expressionless, flanked by 2 elders and a single figure cloaked in duskin, her face hidden beneath a veil of beads and shadow. Evan dismounted slowly, every motion deliberate. This wasn't the kind of meeting you rushed. The terms had been laid out 3 weeks earlier in terse exchanges over fire and meat. If Evan married the chief's daughter, he'd be granted access to the eastern pasturelands, 100 acres of spring-fed soil that bordered his drought-starved ranch. Along with it, 6 horses, 24 head of cattle, and the goodwill of a tribe that no longer trusted paper treaties or white men's handshakes. This was older. This was binding. He didn't ask for love, he asked for land. As the circle parted, Nelina stepped forward. Her veil lifted in the breeze, just enough for him to see the curve of her cheek, the line of her mouth closed and resolute. Her eyes never met his. She stood like someone carved from river rock, elegant and impenetrable. When the medicine man began the rites in both tongues, her lips moved, but there was no voice behind them, no inflection. No pause to breathe. Evan repeated his own vows stiffly, feeling like a man building a fence with no posts all form, no root. The words tasted like sawdust in his throat. "I will honor her," he said. And even the wind seemed to pause, listening for whether he meant it. She never looked up. The elders placed a buffalo hide between them, symbolic of shared earth. Chief Hashke placed a strand of turquoise beads around Evan's neck, the weight of it heavy and cold. Nelina was given a small bundle, a pouch containing tobacco, corn, and 3 black stones. A woman behind her, likely her aunt or sister, whispered something in Apache. Nelina nodded once, still without meeting his eyes. When the rites ended, no one clapped, no one cheered. The circle dissolved like smoke, and Evan found himself standing beside his new bride, unsure whether to speak or offer his hand. She walked past him without a word, her steps light, almost reluctant. Like a deer approaching a trap it already knew it couldn't escape. They rode back to the ranch in silence. She didn't ask about the land, or the house, or the name she now bore. She just stared out at the ridges, her expression unreadable. Evan caught glimpses of her in the reflection of his canteen, in the shadow she cast on the dirt. Still no smile, still no voice. The sun dipped behind the hills as they arrived, casting long shadows across the empty fields he now hoped to fill with Apache cattle and promise. But even as he looked over the expanse of land stretching beyond the fence line, he felt it. The air wasn't filled with opportunity. It was thick with debt. And the woman who now bore his name was not a bride. She was the ledger. The sun burned low on the horizon, casting copper light across the scrubland, and turning the sparse chapel of cottonwood trunks and woven willow into a cathedral of shadows. Dust hung in the air, unmoving, suspended like breath held too long. Men from both sides, white settlers in stiff suits, and Apache elders in feathers and bone, lined the outer edges of the clearing, forming 2 silent, watching walls. There were no flowers, no music, only the relentless creak of the wind and the low murmurs of horses shifting behind the tree line. Evan Callahan stood tall in a jacket that didn't quite fit, the collar chafing his neck, sweat prickling along his spine. His mouth shaped a smile, thin and wooden, as he glanced from one stern face to another. Somewhere behind him, one of his ranch hands cleared his throat, nervous. Another muttered something about ghost weddings under his breath. Evan didn't turn. Then she stepped forward. Nelina's face was painted in ceremonial white and ochre, a striking contrast to the raven black of her hair, braided tight against her back. Across her brow, a line of red marked the path of blood, not hers, not today, but symbolic of past harm and future cost. Her dress, though modest, shimmered faintly with sewn shells and beads that caught the dying light. But her eyes, they were wrong. They didn't blink, didn't shift, didn't soften. They were empty. Not in the way a woman might be frightened. There was no fear in her, no resistance either, but no surrender, no presence. It was as though her body had arrived, but her spirit remained just beyond reach, circling above the gathered crowd like a hawk refusing to land. The officiant, a translator caught between tongues and tensions, began to speak. First in English, then in Apache. Words of union, of harmony, of shared future. Evan stood straighter, trying to meet the moment with something close to dignity. But every time his eyes brushed hers, he felt hollow. Like he'd stepped into someone else's story and forgotten his lines. When prompted, he said, "I do," clear and loud enough for the elders to hear. The translator turned to Nalina, repeating the phrase in Apache. She said nothing. A long pause. The wind picked up, not harsh, but cold, unseasonal. The officiant hesitated, looking to Chief Hashgay. The old man gave the slightest nod. Again, the question in Apache. Again, no reply. But this time, Nalina blinked once, almost imperceptibly, and lowered her gaze. The translator took it as assent. The ceremony continued. Evan forced another smile, this one tighter than the last. He glanced at the settlers behind him, all eyes, no cheers. The Apache contingent remained stone-faced, unmoving. The air felt heavier now, like a storm was hiding just behind the Sunday. When the ritual completed, Evan reached out to take her hand. Her fingers touched his, light as wind-blown ash, but made no effort to hold. She never spoke, not a single word. And as they stood side by side, bound by vows that only one of them had voiced, Evan realized something he hadn't expected. It wasn't rage that lived behind her silence. It was judgment, ancient, measured, patient, and it terrified him more than any war cry ever could. The night came down like a shudder, sudden and absolute. Outside the lodge, the wind turned feral, dragging dry branches across the earth like bones being scraped. Pine needles whispered against stretched hide, and the wooden ribs of the lodge creaked under the strain. Evan lay still on the woven mat, eyes open, staring into the dark space above him, where smoke from the central fire coiled and vanished into the chimney hole. The fire had long since burned low, leaving only a dull red glow that pulsed like a buried heartbeat. The air inside was heavy with sage, and something older, something bitter and medicinal. He hadn't spoken since they crossed the threshold, neither had she. Nalina had gone to the far corner with the elder woman, someone Evan hadn't met before today. Gray-haired and stooped, wrapped in a thick wool shawl, the woman moved with slow precision as she unpacked items from a small bundle. A dried gourd, a length of rawhide cord, a tiny pouch of ash. Nalina sat cross-legged before her, her dress now exchanged for ceremonial sleep garb, plain, bone-colored, modest. Evan had pretended to sleep at first, unsure of whether he was meant to witness whatever they were doing. But something in their hush pulled at him. He kept his breathing slow, his eyes cracked open just enough to see the shapes of their silhouettes etched against the dim red light. The elder murmured something in Apache, voice low and hoarse. Nalina replied, softer still. Her voice was the sound of river stones clicking beneath the current, steady, certain, invisible, unless you were listening hard. Then another phrase. Then another. Evan couldn't catch the meaning. The rhythm was strange, like a chant, like something older than prayer and colder than ceremony. Then came a word he did know. A word he remembered from an old trade argument months ago, when an Apache man had spatted at a white merchant and walked away without the goods. Chidi. Debt? He blinked, the word slicing clean through the haze. It wasn't said with resentment or anger. Nalina's voice didn't rise, but the weight of it settled in the room like smoke, clinging to the walls, the floor, the skin. The elder nodded slowly, once, then reached into the pouch and spread a fine gray ash across Nalina's open palms. Nalina brought her hands to her forehead, pressing the ash to her skin. Then she closed her eyes. Evan felt a chill move across him, not from the cold, but from the certainty that he was intruding on something sacred, something meant only for those who had earned grief through blood or silence. He thought of the land he'd just gained. The cattle. The title deed now locked in the drawer of his desk. He thought of the way Nalina had never met his gaze, not once, not even during the vows. And he thought of that word again. Debt? Not alliance, not marriage. Something owed. He rolled to his side, facing the lodge wall, pretending sleep again. But the ash scent lingered in his nose, and her voice echoed through his memory long into the night, reciting phrases he didn't know, bound together by the single truth he did. This union was not born of love. It was an account being settled, and he didn't yet know the cost. The wagons rolled in before sunrise, the creak of wooden wheels cutting through the early silence like a blade through soft pine. Dust rose behind them, catching the slanted light of morning, and turning the procession into a mirage. Evan stood on the porch with a cup of scalding coffee in hand, boots braced, watching them come. 3 wagons, 2 riders, and a herd of 6 lean Appaloosas trailing behind like ghosts. His ranch hands emerged one by one, faces curious, half-dressed, and squinting through the haze. No one had expected the delivery so soon. The agreement had been formalized just 2 days earlier, and yet here it was prompt, deliberate, exact. By the time the lead wagon halted in front of the main house, Nalina had stepped out too. She didn't stand beside Evan. She didn't look at him. She simply folded her arms, the morning wind tugging her braid, and watched as her people began to unload the ledger of their loss. 2 rifles first. Long-barreled Henrys, polished clean. They were handed down carefully, as if they held more weight than steel and wood should carry. Then came sacks of grain, tightly bound and marked with Apache symbols Evan couldn't read. One of the riders dismounted and gestured to a rolled parchment, the deed to the disputed grazing land near Bitter Creek. The chief's seal was burned into the leather strip that held it closed. "Hell of a wedding gift," one of Evan's ranch hands muttered. Another whistled low when the 3rd wagon tarp was drawn back, revealing 2 crates of tools and tanned hides thick enough to trade for silver, sturdy enough to outfit a dozen riders. "Married into fortune, Callahan," someone said with a grin. "You done good." Evan didn't answer. He was watching Nalina. She hadn't moved, but her jaw had tightened. Her gaze wasn't distant, it was measuring. Each item handed off, each mark on the manifest, she followed with the intensity of an accountant watching coin disappear into another man's palm. Not grief, exactly, not anger, but a grim familiarity, as though every piece of wealth that crossed into Evan's yard stripped something irreplaceable from her people. She flinched just slightly when the Appaloosas were tied off at the corral. That was the only moment she looked straight at the animals. Then she turned away and walked back into the house without a word. Evan's stomach twisted. He should have felt proud, or satisfied. The deal was complete. Everything they'd agreed to, delivered in full. He could graze cattle on lush land that had once been barred to men like him. He could trade the rifles for 10 times their worth if he pleased. He could fence the property and triple his herd by year's end. And yet, as the sun crept higher and the air grew thick with the scent of fresh hay and saddle leather, all he felt was the hollowness her silence left behind. Because it wasn't just goods being transferred that day. It was inheritance. It was pride. It was apology in physical form, dressed up as generosity. And the woman he now called wife had watched it all with the eyes of someone watching her ancestors' bones being packed away and sold. Not one item had been for her. The air inside the cabin that night was thick with quiet. Not silence, no, it was heavier than that. It was the kind of quiet that presses into the bones, dense and full of what wasn't said. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting a soft orange glow across the walls, turning their shadows into figures of a different life. Outside, coyotes howled far off in the hills, but the sound didn't carry inside. The walls were too thick with expectation. Evan sat on the edge of the bed, boots off, shirt unbuttoned halfway down, listening to the creak of floorboards as Nalina moved barefoot around the cabin. She had changed into a plain nightdress, the hem brushing the tops of her ankles like fog skimming water. Her face was unreadable, the paint from the wedding now gone, scrubbed away with river water and ash. In its place was only skin bare, solemn, human, and a tension that didn't belong in a bride. He had offered her wine, she didn't touch it. He'd tried a gentle question about the land near Bitter Creek, neutral, casual. She didn't answer. It wasn't anger, it was restraint. A cold, purposeful holding back that made him feel more like a guest than a groom. They had barely spoken since the wagons had come. Evan turned down the covers, and that's when he saw it. The glint came first, a faint flicker of reflection in the low firelight. He reached for it, half thinking it was a hairpin or a piece of jewelry left behind, something small and harmless. But his fingers closed around carved bone. He pulled it out and held it in both hands, a ceremonial blade, no longer than his forearm. The handle was wrapped in hide, etched with symbols he didn't understand. The blade itself was dark, not metal, but obsidian black, glassy and sharp as regret. There was no dust on it, no wear. It had been placed there recently, deliberately. He looked up. Nalina was standing at the foot of the bed, still as a tree in the moments before a storm. Her eyes, at last, met his. No veil, no blinking. Just two fixed points of gravity pulling his breath from his lungs. "You'll need it by dawn," she said. The words were simple, calm, but they landed like a death knell. Evan's throat went dry. "What does that mean?" he asked, voice lower than he intended. She didn't answer. Instead, she walked to the far side of the bed, pulled the blanket over her legs, and lay back, facing away from him. Her braids spilled over the pillow like dark rope, and her breathing evened out within minutes. Not sleep, not really. Just stillness practiced enough to look like peace. Evan sat frozen for a while longer, the blade still in his hands, heavier than iron, though it couldn't have weighed more than a pound. The symbols on the hilt seemed to flicker as the fire danced. He set the knife gently on the table beside him, but he didn't lie down. He didn't close his eyes. He couldn't. Because whatever waited between sunset and sunrise wasn't in the blade. It was in the vow she hadn't spoken, and the reckoning she had. The morning broke sharp and cold, wind tumbling down off the ridgeline with a bite that didn't match the season. The sky was clear, painfully blue, but the air carried a tension Evan felt before he saw it, a kind of stillness that made birds hush and dogs pace. He was halfway through checking the tack room when one of his ranch hands, Jesse, came striding toward him, eyes wide, hat clenched in his hands. "There's tracks by the corral," Jesse said, not out of breath, but speaking like someone who'd seen something that made his stomach turn. "Boot prints. Fresh." Evan set down the bridle and followed him without a word. The corral fence had been undisturbed, but the dust near the back gate told a different story. Someone had walked in. Not from the front trail, but from the ridge where the rocks dropped steep into thick brush. The prints were shallow but clear, long stride, purposeful, a single rider. Not Apache-style moccasins either, these were boot prints, square-heeled, wide at the toe. And one of the Appaloosas was gone. Evan's jaw locked tight. He crouched, ran his fingers through the dirt, and traced the outline of the tracks as they veered away toward the north end of the fence line, disappearing into the undergrowth. The horse hadn't been spooked. It'd been led. He stood slowly and scanned the hills beyond the ranch. Nothing moved up there, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching now still. When he returned to the house, Nalina was already outside, seated on the edge of the porch, weaving what looked like a thin strip of sinew between her fingers. Her face was turned toward the horizon, not the direction of the missing horse, but east toward the mountains where her people had once moved freely, before borders were drawn and treaties broken. "You see anything last night?" Evan asked, not harshly, not yet. She didn't turn. "I hear many things," she said. Someone was near the corral. A pause. The wind picked up, lifting strands of her braid. "One horse is gone," he added. She finished the knot and tied it tight. "Then someone rides now," she said softly. "That's it?" he asked. "You're not going to tell me who, why?" This time she met his eyes, and something flickered there, not surprise, not guilt, but inevitability. They came to see what you are, she said. Evan took a step forward. You knew they'd come. Nalina didn't answer. She stood and walked back into the house, leaving the finished knot resting on the porch railing like a marker. By midday, the men had already started talking. Jesse claimed he'd heard stories about vengeance marriages, about how tribes, when dishonored, would give a daughter to their enemy not as an olive branch, but as bait. A way to buy time while the real price circled closer. Another hand muttered about blood debts, about how Apache law didn't forget, only waited. They're watching him, one said. No, another whispered. They're watching her, waiting to see if she does it herself. Evan tried to brush it off, but the weight of the blade she'd left on the nightstand still lingered in his mind, and the way she had said it, "You'll need it," by dawn wasn't a warning. It had been a certainty. That night, when the fire was lit and the animals secured, Evan double-checked the windows and bolted the doors. But the wind still came howling down from the ridge, and with it, a feeling he couldn't shake, that the horse wasn't stolen. It had been sent. The sun was at its highest when the rider appeared on the southern trail, kicking up a slow coil of dust behind him. He rode alone, upright in the saddle, no visible weapons but wrapped in authority that made the ranch hands pause in their work and watch in silence. Evan stepped off the porch as the man dismounted, boots landing with a soft thud in the dirt. He was Apache older, broad-shouldered, with salt in his black hair and lines etched deep into his face. He wore no paint, no feathers, only a pale cotton shirt tucked into dark slacks and a medicine pouch at his throat. A man caught between two languages, and judging by the eyes he carried, he bore the weight of both. "Name's Tocha," he said in careful English. "I speak for those who still try to speak to you." Evan offered his hand. Tocha didn't take it. "I came to talk, not to trade," he said. "May we walk?" They circled the edge of the property. Boots crunching over dry grass, the sound of hammering echoing from the barn where Jesse and the others busied themselves with chores they no longer seemed to believe mattered. "She doesn't speak much," Evan said after a long silence. "But she watches, listens." Tocha nodded. "That is her right." "I know what people are saying," Evan added. "About why she was sent. You should listen to them." Evan stopped. "Then tell me plain, why her, why me?" Tocha turned to face him fully now. The wind blew dust between them, sharp and dry. "This marriage is not protection," he said, voice low and without ornament. "It's a countdown." Evan's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" "It means time is running out. For you, for her, for peace." Evan folded his arms. "I was told this marriage would settle things, create goodwill. I've held up my end." "You've collected land and cattle," Tocha said, "but you don't understand the cost. You think she was given to you." Evan didn't respond. "She was offered," Tocha went on, "because there are things your people took that can't be returned. Not with rifles, not with horses, not even with her, but still your kind wants balance in ledgers. This was a way to keep blood off the dirt. For a little while." "What sin?" Evan asked, his voice sharp now. "What exactly am I paying for?" Tocha tilted his head. "Your brother," he said. "Among others, a hunting party that trespassed last spring. Sacred ground. A girl left behind. Unmarked, unnamed. She was kin to Nalina. You didn't ask." Evan's stomach dropped. "She's here," Tocha continued. "Not to bind peace, but to watch. To see if you're like them. To see if mercy is deserved. When the time comes, if judgment must fall, she'll speak." Evan stepped back, the edges of his vision narrowing. Tocha gave him one long look, unreadable. "She hasn't spoken it yet. That should mean something." He mounted again, reins loose in hand. "But the clock's still ticking, Mr. Callahan." As the rider disappeared down the trail, Evan stood rooted in place, sweat cold at his neck. Inside the house, he saw movement through the window. Nalina, standing at the table, her fingers tracing something onto a strip of cloth. A symbol, a warning. And in that moment, he realized it wasn't the tribe that had sent her. It was the dead itself. The sky turned strange by midday, clear blue in every direction except the north. There, across the far hills beyond the grazing line, a thin column of black smoke curled upward, slow and deliberate, like ink spilled into water. Not wildfire, not signal fire either. Something in between. Intentional, controlled. A message sent not just across miles, but across time. Evan stood at the edge of the property with his hands on his hips, eyes narrowed against the glare. His chest tightened. It wasn't the first fire he'd seen on the ridge, but it was the first since the marriage. The ranch hands noticed too. They didn't speak about it directly, but their pace slowed. Eyes wandered skyward. Chores left half-finished. Even the animals seemed restless, horses stomping in place, eyes white-rimmed and ears pinned back, as if they sensed what the men didn't yet have the nerve to say aloud. Back at the lodge, Nelina moved with quiet urgency. She had brought a knife out from beneath the floorboards, different from the obsidian blade Evan had found that first night. This one was worn, utilitarian. A carving tool. She crouched beside the lodge poles, sleeves rolled up, braid draped over one shoulder, and began to etch symbols into the wood. Evan watched from the doorway, uncertain if he should speak. The marks were angular and sharp, some clean lines, others jagged slashes. Not decorative, not careless. They were messages, and though Evan couldn't read them, he felt their purpose in the way she cut them methodically, reverently, as if the wood itself were being told a secret. He stepped forward. "What do they mean?" he asked. She didn't look up, her hand never stopped. "Are they warnings?" A pause. Then the knife slowed and stopped, blade resting against the wood. She sat back on her heels and finally turned toward him. "They come for what was taken," she said. Her voice, so seldom heard, struck harder than a rifle shot. Not raised, not trembling, just true. Evan's mouth went dry. "You mean your people?" "No," she said. "Not only." He looked back toward the ridge, smoke still rising like a question he didn't want answered. "Who leads them?" he asked. She stood, wiping the blade clean against her dress. "There is no one leader," she said. "Only pain that remembers the shape of its source." He didn't know what to say to that. The words sounded old, like they'd been passed down rather than spoken fresh. She walked past him, into the cabin, and returned moments later with a small bundle of sage and red cloth. She tied it to the corner post of the lodge, letting it flap in the breeze like a silent flare. Evan stood beside her now, both of them watching the horizon. "They'll come here?" he asked. She nodded once. "Are you with them?" he asked. This time she didn't answer. But she didn't have to. The symbols carved into the lodge poles had already answered for her. They weren't warnings to her people. They were declarations to his. A reckoning was coming not because she wanted it, but because it had been promised. And somewhere in the smoke rising over the hills, the promise was being kept. Ash Ridge rose like a spine out of the earth. Jagged bone-colored stone laced with the charred remnants of old fires and bitter memories. The wind was sharp up there, cutting through the layers of dust and sweat on Evan's face as he reined in his horse at the crest. Below him, the war party waited in a half-circle formation, still as sentinels, their horses cloaked in silence, their riders cloaked in grief and war paint. They had been waiting. Chief Hashkay stood at the center, tall and unmoving, the feathers in his headdress caught in the rising breeze. His eyes were fixed on Evan not with fury, but with a grim, almost paternal resolve. There was no welcome in those eyes, no room for negotiation, as Evan had known it. This was not a man arriving to make a deal. This was a man prepared to close an account. Evan dismounted slowly, raising both hands to show he came without rifle or pistol. But every step he took felt like one deeper into a grave. "I came to talk," Evan called out. No one moved. Then, the chief raised a hand. "You came to take," he replied, voice like gravel and thunder. "Now you speak of talk." Evan stood his ground. "I married her. I kept my word." A murmur swept through the riders' dry laughter, bitter and short. "You married a daughter you never asked about. You made a trade you did not understand. And now you stand here like a man who has been wronged?" the chief said. "She was offered," Evan said, jaw clenched. "She was sent," Hashke snapped. "To show us who you are, to see if your hands build or destroy. But your land drinks the blood of my kin. Your brother took what he could not repay, and you walk in his footsteps." "I didn't know what he'd done," Evan said, voice lower now. "I never agreed to that. Your ignorance is not innocence." Another rider stepped forward, a younger man with a scar down the side of his face. He held up a small pouch, dangling from a thong of leather. "Do you recognize this?" he asked, voice hot. Evan squinted. The pouch looked familiar until he remembered. It had once hung from his brother's saddle horn. It had been missing since spring. "Found it buried near the old spring," the man said. "Near her bones." Evan's stomach dropped. "You offer marriage," Hashke said, stepping closer. "But the ground cries out. The girl who was lost, her spirit walks. You build fences across our dead, and you ask us to forgive?" "I didn't ask for this," Evan whispered. "No," the chief said, "but you inherited it." He gestured behind him, to a rider who stepped forward with a bundle wrapped in deerskin. Unrolled slowly, it revealed an Apache sash, torn and stained too small for a woman. "She was only 15, the chief said. Evan's eyes burned. "This is your choice," Hashke continued, voice like flint scraping steel. "Die tonight, or return what was never yours. The land, the cattle, the bride. Every piece of it paid in blood you did not spill, but now carry." The wind howled across the ridge, lifting ash and dust in spirals around them. Evan looked down at his hands. Empty. Calloused. Trembling. "What would you do? What would you do? Would you defend what you never truly earned? Or return what you were never meant to hold?" The fire on the ridge crackled louder. Behind the chief, the war party waited not with rage, but with resolution. The ride back from Ash Ridge felt longer than it had ever been. Though Evan's horse took the same trail, the same turns, the same gentle descent down into the basin. The land hadn't changed. The fence lines still stood. The dust still curled around the hooves of his gelding. But everything looked different now, as if the very earth had recoiled from his passing. The wind didn't sing through the cottonwoods at whispered accusations. When he reached the ranch, Nalina was already outside, seated near the old well, her hands submerged in a basin of water. Her sleeves were rolled, exposing slender forearms speckled with ash and something darker. She didn't rise, didn't speak, just kept washing something over and over in the basin, a strip of fabric. Red once, now brown at the edges. Evan dismounted, boots heavy against the earth. He approached slowly, as though nearing a grave. The wind shifted, and he caught the faintest scent of juniper smoke sage, maybe something ceremonial, something meant for the dead. "You knew," he said. Nalina's fingers paused in the water. She didn't look up. "She was your sister," he continued, voice rough. "The girl they spoke of." Now she looked at him. Her eyes held no fire, no fury, only a bottomless, exhausted truth. She nodded once. "She followed your brother into the high canyon," Nalina said, voice barely above a whisper. "She thought he was kind." He laughed when she spoke. "She thought that meant something." Evan felt his knees weaken. He braced against the well, the stones biting into his palms. "What did he do?" he asked, though he already knew. "He took her beads," she said, as if that detail mattered more than anything else. Tore them from her neck. She tried to run. He called her little rabbit as she bled. Her voice didn't waver. He buried her in the rocks, shallow. Evan closed his eyes. A heat surged in his chest, shame, fury, helplessness. His brother, Micah, the one who had vanished in spring, leaving behind an unpaid saloon tab and a trail of angry ranchers. Evan had thought he'd ridden off to California, maybe south toward the border. He'd never asked questions, never thought to. Nalina continued. The sash you saw, my mother wove it when my sister began her first moon. She was supposed to wear it the day she chose her name. Evan gripped the stone harder. They said the dowry was a gift. A show of goodwill. Nalina pulled the fabric from the water, squeezing it slowly. It was not a gift, it was restitution, a way to delay the blood price. But nothing stays delayed forever. He looked at her, really looked at the lines in her face that didn't belong to a young bride, at the way she held stillness like armor, at the sorrow she wore like skin. I didn't know, he said. She studied him. But you lived in his house, rode his horses, drank from the same cup. He couldn't deny it. You were not chosen because you are guilty, she said. You were chosen because you are close enough to carry the weight. A crow called out overhead, circling once before vanishing into the blinding afternoon Sunday. Evan stared into the basin, at the ripples spreading outward from her hands. It wasn't a marriage, it never had been. It was an inheritance. Of guilt. Of silence. Of sin. The night sank thick and unforgiving over the ranch, and the air inside the cabin felt tighter than the sky itself. Evan sat at the edge of the hearth long after the fire had gone to embers, the only light coming from the oil lamp flickering beside him. Shadows stretched long across the floor, trembling with every gust of wind that rattled the walls. He hadn't spoken in hours, not to Nalina, not to the hands. Something had settled in him, a stillness, heavy and grim. The words from Ash Ridge still echoed. So did Nalina's, soft but unshakable. You were chosen because you are close enough to carry the weight. He hadn't eaten, couldn't. A rot had begun to spread not in the walls, not in the wood but inside him. Doubt, shame, a seeping sickness he could no longer push aside with excuses or ignorance. And the deeper it spread, the more he remembered. Micah. Riding in late with blood on his boots, shrugging off questions. Laughing too loud at the saloon when he thought no one was listening. Evan had buried the signs then. Buried them like someone afraid to turn over a stone and find something that would change everything. Now the stone was gone. Now there was only what lay beneath. He rose suddenly, the old floorboards groaning under his weight. He crossed the cabin in silence, to the far side of the room, past the hearth, to where the loose plank had always annoyed him. He'd stepped on it 100 times, cursed it twice as many, but never pried it up. Tonight, he did. The wood came up easy, and beneath it, wrapped in a canvas roll, was a satchel weathered, stiff with dust and age. The leather was cracked, the buckles rusted. His brother's initials were scorched into the strap. Micah Callahan. Evan hesitated for the briefest moment before opening it. Inside were scraps of a life run wrong, a half-used tobacco pouch, a deck of cards worn soft at the edges, and at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth, something heavier. He unfolded it with slow hands. A silver pendant slid out first, cold and gleaming even in the low lamplight. Apache etching curled around its edges, symbols Evan couldn't read but recognized now. It wasn't jewelry, it was ceremonial. Sacred. Meant to be worn during rites of passage. It didn't belong to his brother. Next came a strip of cloth. White originally, now stained a deep, dried brown. Blood. Not old blood from the field or a cattle wound. This had soaked through, blotted, not smeared. The pattern of it told its own story. like someone had held it to a wound that refused to close. Beneath that, a crumpled note, barely legible. "She saw me, said my name. I didn't mean to." The rest trailed off into a blur of ink and water damage. Evan stared at the bundle in his lap, the weight of it anchoring him in place. The pendant reflected the flicker of the oil lamp, casting small curved shadows that moved like spirits across the wall. His brother hadn't just fled. He had hidden this, buried it here, on Evan's land, under Evan's roof. And now, like a ghost, Micah had returned not in body, but in consequence. The blood had never really dried. And now it was seeping up through the floor. The journey to the tribal grounds began before first light. Evan rode alone, the satchel strapped across his chest like a mark of shame. Nalina trailed behind him on foot, silent, wrapped in a thick shawl the color of storm clouds. She hadn't said a word when he told her what he'd found beneath the floorboards. She had only looked at the cloth, at the pendant, and then at him. And that had been enough. The land grew quieter as they neared the circle, no birdsong, no wind through the branches, only the crunch of hooves and the distant crackle of fire. The council had gathered at the old cedar ring, a place older than treaties, older than fences. A dozen figures stood around the ceremonial fire, cloaks drawn close, faces painted with solemn lines. Chief Hashke stood among them, unmoving, his staff planted into the soil like a flag of mourning. No one acknowledged Evan as he dismounted. That was part of it. He was not a guest, not a participant. He was an accused man, a carrier of sin. He stepped forward alone, cradling the satchel in both hands like an offering at a grave. Nalina stepped beside him. She did not stand behind him, nor before. She stood as witness. Evan looked to the chief. "I come to confess a debt," he said, his voice louder than it felt in his chest. "And offer what's mine in return." The chief gave a slight nod to Nalina, who turned to the council and began translating in Apache, her voice clear and steady. She did not embellish, she did not falter. Evan opened the satchel. He withdrew the pendant first. The silver caught the morning light and seemed to hold it, refusing to give it back. He held it aloft, then placed it at the feet of the chief without a word. Then came the blood-stained cloth, still folded, still stiff. He laid it beside the pendant. Last, he removed the deed to his land. He had signed it that morning, trembling hands scrawling his name with ink that bled like guilt. He unfolded the parchment and placed it beside the others. "This is all I have," he said. "This ranch, this land. It was bought with things I never earned. My brother stole life from this tribe." He silenced a girl who should have spoken her name and grown old. He looked around the circle. No eyes blinked, no faces softened. "So I give it all back. I kneel now, not as payment, but as proof." And he did. He sank to both knees, the dust rising beneath him, settling into his clothes, into his skin. His voice lowered. "I offer mine in her place." A long silence followed. Then a drumbeat. One strike. Final. Echoing. An elder woman stepped forward. She reached down and lifted the pendant, holding it to the firelight. She murmured something in Apache, something that made the others stir. Nalina translated, barely above a whisper. "She says it belongs to the dead no longer. It has chosen a path." Evan bowed his head. The wind shifted, bringing the scent of smoke and pine. Chief Hashke stepped forward at last, towering over Evan. His eyes held the weight of years, of loss, of choices made in the wake of ashes. "Judgment is not mercy," he said. But today, they walked together. Evan looked up, eyes glistening. Not with relief, but with something closer to peace. Something earned the hard way. Something true. The wind that had hung dry and watchful all morning began to shift as the silence deepened. The air no longer carried heat, it cooled, faintly, like the exhale before rain. Smoke from the ceremonial fire curved differently now, lifting rather than settling, curling skyward in thin ribbons, as if the spirits themselves were leaning in to listen. Evan remained kneeling, his head bowed, the ground beneath him hard-packed and dry. Dust clung to his palms, to his knees, to the sweat trickling down the side of his face. He hadn't moved since placing the blood-stained cloth and pendant before the council. His words still hovered in the air, the echo of his surrender not yet faded. Then came the sound of movement, soft, deliberate. Footsteps in the dust, the whisper of fabric and leather. Nalina. She stepped forward into the center of the circle, the shawl falling from her shoulders, revealing the ceremonial dress she had worn on their wedding night undyed, unadorned now. In her hands, she held the obsidian blade, the one Evan had found beneath her side of the bed, its curved edge gleaming faintly like black water under moonlight. She paused before him. The firelight caught in her eyes, not softening them, but sharpening them, like they'd been forged in the same heat as the blade. She looked at the council first, then to her father, Chief Hashke, whose grip on his war-staff remained taut but unreadable. Then she spoke. Not in English. In Apache. He spoke truth. The words carried in the open air, carried through the circle like the tolling of a bell, simple and unyielding. She knelt not to Evan, but before the items he had laid down, she placed the knife gently at his feet, blade facing away, hilt toward him. Then she stood and stepped back. The circle stirred. Murmurs, breath drawn in, shoulders shifting. The war party tensed, but no one moved to take the blade. No one challenged her. Evan looked up just enough to see the knife there, resting in the dust, untouched. Not a weapon now, not a threat. A symbol. Behind Nalina, Chief Hashke stepped forward. His war staff, long and carved with the stories of his people, struck the earth once, then slowly, deliberately, he lowered it. Not dropped. Lowered. The gesture was not one of surrender, it was recognition. Judgment, when witnessed with honesty, had spoken. And for the first time since Evan had knelt, the wind picked up again, this time warmer, carrying the scent of sage, of earth newly stirred. The elder woman who had earlier lifted the pendant, now raised her hand toward the sky and closed her eyes. A few others followed. The circle loosened, not broken but softened. Evan reached out and wrapped his fingers around the hilt of the knife. He did not lift it. He only held it, grounding himself, the weight familiar now. Nalina met his gaze across the fire. For the first time, there was no veil between them. No bargain. No silence. Only the sound of the wind changing. And the quiet, unmistakable sense that the land, at last, had heard the truth. The fence broke sometime in the night. Not shattered, not torn down in fury, just opened. A single section cut clean. The wire loosened and coiled like a snake asleep in the dirt. The posts stood untouched, the gate swinging slightly in the breeze, creaking like a whisper through old wood. The herd was already gone by the time Evan stepped outside, boots crunching in the brittle morning frost, rifle slung uselessly over his shoulder. No signs of struggle, no scattered hoofprints in panic, only tracks in orderly rows, headed north, back toward the ridgeline. They hadn't stolen the cattle. They had reclaimed them. He stood at the edge of the field for a long time, watching the sun rise slow behind the trees. There was no smoke this time, no signal. The message had already been delivered, and now it was carried out quiet, bloodless, resolute. Behind him, the house stood still. Nalina stood in the doorway, wrapped in her storm-colored shawl, arms folded across her chest. She hadn't stopped him when he rose to check the fields. She hadn't needed to. They both knew what this was. By midday, the rest of the dowry followed suit. The 2 rifles, returned to their cases, lay at the edge of the property line, wrapped in buffalo hide and bound with sinew. The horses were gone, let out in silence before dawn. their halters left behind on the porch rail, woven grass cords curling like wilted stems. Even the grain sacks were lifted from the storehouse. Every item that had once been handed over, now taken back without violence, without words. It was not revenge. It was redress. And the ranch, once full of motion and voices and animals, stood still in its skeleton form, all shape, no flesh. Evan sat on the porch steps, elbows on his knees, watching the empty pasture with eyes that didn't blink much anymore. He hadn't said a word since the last bundle was taken. He'd only nodded when Nalina pointed to what was being carried and told him, simply, "It wasn't yours." She sat beside him now, close but not touching. The wind had picked up again, tugging gently at the ends of her shawl, sweeping her braid against her shoulder like a pendulum. Time moved, but neither of them did. He turned his head slowly. "So what does that make us?" She didn't answer right away. Then, finally, "Not bound by law, not by ritual." He nodded. That much he'd figured. The ceremony had been broken the moment truth replaced silence. "But you're still here," he said. She looked at him. "So are you." The wind moved through the hollowed-out corral, whistling low, like a breath between two words. They sat there, neither bride nor groom now. No contract, no dowry, no false foundation holding up what had been broken from the start. Only two people, stripped of every pretense. And still together. Not because they had to be, but because, in the ashes of all that was taken and returned, something had remained. Something that had not been bargained for, and would not be surrendered. The clearing behind the lodge had once been a place of ceremony. Before the fence line crept too close, before the corrals were built and the land divided by wire and deed. Now, the grass was thin, the stones scattered, many buried beneath years of wind-blown dust and ranching debris. But the shape was still there, faint but indelible, a memory pressed into the earth. Evan found Nalina kneeling at its center. She moved slowly, hands covered in ash, drawing the ancient circle back into being. Not for show, not for him. She hadn't asked him to help, she hadn't even looked up when he approached. But something in the way she worked, methodical, reverent, drew him forward, until he crouched beside her without a word. He began gathering stones. She watched, just briefly. Then returned to her task. Together, in a silence deeper than speech, they cleared the brush, dug the earth back with their hands, and replaced the stones that had marked the sacred boundary. Some were still stained with soot from long ago fires. Others were chipped at the edges, as if time itself had tried to wear the memory away. Evan didn't ask what the circle was for. He knew, in some way, it wasn't his to define. But he felt its gravity in his bones, the way the wind hushed when they stepped within it, the way even the birds held back from singing above it. By the time they placed the last stone, the sun had begun to set, casting long red shadows across the ridge. The circle glowed faintly in the dying light, a seam stitched closed again after a long tearing. Nalina sat cross-legged at its edge, hands in her lap, breathing slow. Evan stood across from her, unsure if he should stay. Then she asked, "Why didn't you run?" Her voice was quiet. Not an accusation, just a question sharpened by the weight of everything they'd already endured. He looked at her, really looked at the soot on her fingers, the way her braid clung to her neck in the evening heat, the quiet tension in her shoulders that hadn't fully relaxed since the day they met. The knife had never been lifted. The council had let him live, but her question wasn't about that moment. It was about the one after. He knelt slowly at the other side of the circle. "I thought about it," he said. The truth sat heavy between them. "But you looked at me like I still could be forgiven," he added. And that was more than anyone else ever did. She didn't speak again for a long time. Then, gently, she brushed the ash from her palms and reached forward. Not to touch him, but to draw one more line in the dirt between them, a short arc that curved inward, closing the circle fully, A seal. The wind shifted. Not strong. Just enough to stir the smoke from the lodge chimney, sending it curling toward the horizon. In that moment, no vows were spoken. But one was made. Not by marriage. By choice. The days had grown quiet since the council. The land breathed differently now, as though exhaling after a long-held breath. The cattle were gone, the fences left in disrepair, and yet Evan and Nalina had not rebuilt what was lost. They tended only to what remained. The garden was small but growing. The well still drew clean water. Some nights they cooked over an open fire, eating in silence as dusk settled like dust over their shoulders. She did not leave, and he did not ask why. But the wind still watched, and the ridgeline still held secrets. It was just past sundown when the rider appeared. First a sound distant, arrhythmic. Not the sure rhythm of a working horse, but something dragging, broken. Evan looked up from the field, spade still in his hand, and narrowed his eyes toward the horizon. The moon hung low and yellow over the hills, painting the land in pale tones of bone and ash. A figure emerged from the shadows beyond the trail. The horse moved slow, uneven, foam thick around its mouth. Its rider slumped forward, one hand barely holding the reins. Blood soaked through his shirt at the ribs. A rough beard shadowed his jaw, and his face, what little could be seen, was gaunt, eyes hollowed out like they'd stared too long into something unforgiving. Micah. Evan didn't move, didn't speak. The earth might as well have vanished beneath him. Behind the rider, walking barefoot along the path, was another figure. Smaller, lighter, dressed in white. It wasn't the clothes that made her ghost-like. It was the way she moved. Not stumbling, not afraid. As if the weight of her body had already been claimed by another world, and she only walked here as reminder. Her hair was loose and dark, trailing behind her in the breeze. Her eyes, dark, unreadable, were fixed on nothing and everything at once. She walked behind Micah like memory. Like reckoning. Nalina stood in the doorway. She had felt it before it was seen. Her shawl slipped from her shoulders as she stepped into the twilight, a blade glinting faintly in her right hand. The same obsidian curve that Evan had once found beneath her side of the bed. Her eyes locked on the rider. The land did not forget, but it no longer boiled with anger. The fire atop Ash Ridge was never lit again. No war party returned. The air, once thick with dread, had softened into something quieter, more watchful. The tribe accepted the offering not with joy, not even with relief, but with the solemnity of people who had buried too much to celebrate. They called it peace. But they did not call it finished. Micah had been taken from his saddle like a sack of dust. His face, bruised and ashen, barely stirred when they laid him on the floor of the lodge. Days passed. Some nights he screamed in fevered bursts, haunted by voices only he could hear. Other times, he whispered names that did not belong to the living. Nalina did not touch him, did not look at him. She left water beside him each morning. And each evening, she returned to sit at the edge of the fire with Evan and speak the language he was only just learning to understand. It began with small things, words for water, for stone, for wind. Then came the words that cut deeper: guilt, burial, promise. She was a patient teacher, though never a soft one. Her tongue did not bend for his comfort, and when he faltered, she would wait, eyes unblinking, until he tried again. There were no translations for some of what she gave him. Some words, she said, only lived in the mouth of those willing to earn them. The ranch had changed shape. It was smaller now. No cattle, no hired hands. But the soil remained, and the garden grew, and the stones Evan once tripped over now formed paths that led with purpose. In early spring, when the snow finally retreated from the higher ground, they walked together to a patch of earth just beyond the cedar-lined sacred ground once trespassed. No one else came. No one needed to. Evan carried the silver pendant, wrapped in deerskin, the etchings worn now by time and handling. Nalina carried nothing, she wore white. They knelt side by side, as the wind lifted around them. Evan dug the hole with his bare hands. Not because he had to. Because it felt right to feel the weight of the earth one last time. When the hole was ready, he placed the pendant inside. Nalina covered it gently with earth, smoothing the mound with her palm. For a long time, they stayed kneeling. Then she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "Forgiveness isn't forgetting," she said. "It's remembering with mercy." Evan bowed his head. Behind them, the land held its silence, not the heavy silence of grief, but the listening stillness of soil after planting. Something had been buried. Something else had taken root. Micah remained on the ranch, healing slowly, if healing at all. He did not ask for redemption, he barely spoke. Some days he watched the tree line like it would open and swallow him. Other days he tried to help, awkward and unsure, as if unsure whether his hands could build anything again. Whether he survives, that much remains uncertain. But if it were your sister, your blood, your family erased beneath someone else's silence, would you show mercy? Would you let him live? Would you forgive? Or would you demand the debt in kind? What would you demand for your sister's blood? And what story would you carve into the land to make it right?